Magnificent Obsession by Lloyd C. Douglas. Young Watson could hardly have chosen a less opportune moment to put his head in. Mrs. Ashford had a caller, and it was clear that both hostess and guest were laboring under an unusual mental tension. Having something of a storm, indeed. Realizing he was de trop, he was for making a hasty retreat when Nancy recalled him. "Come in. You remember Mr. Merrick?"
"Quite," extending his hand. "I shall always remember you as putting up the gamest fight with pneumonia that I ever watched. And now I hear you're having a battle with Old Man Gray."
Turning to Mrs. Ashford, he stated his errand.
"Your Mr. Folsom is rapidly slipping out. In an hour or two he will be quite unconscious. He inquired for you a few minutes ago. Perhaps you will want to run in and see him. There seems to be none of his people in town."
Murmuring regret, Nancy rose to go. "Will you wait for me?" Merrick nodded.
"I'll go in with this. Take your time. You'll find me here when you get back."
The door closed softly behind them. I reached out my hand greedily for the page Randolph had unfolded, but he shook his head.
"Not just yet," he said, smiling at my eagerness. "I mean to let you see it, but I must tell you something about it first. This page contains the rules for generating that mysterious power I mentioned. By following these instructions to the letter, you can have anything you want, do anything you wish to do, be whatever you like to be. I have tried it. It works. It worked for me. It will work for you."
Combined impatience and incredulity brought a chuckle from me which he did not resent.
"You saw that piece I was working on when you came in this morning?"
"Beautiful," I exclaimed, sincerely.
"You liked it that much?"
He was pleased with my enthusiasm.
"Nothing short of a masterpiece." "Perhaps I should be more grateful for that compliment, Doctor, but I really have had very little to do with it. You may be interested to learn that I was an ordinary stone cutter until about 3 years ago, hacking out stamped letters with a compression chisel. From my youth I had cherished an ambition to do something important in stone, but there was never any money for training, never any time for experiment. Such crude and hasty attempts as I had made from time to time had netted nothing but discouragement. One day I went to the church my little girl attended and heard a preacher read what is on this page. It evidently meant nothing to him, for he read it in a dull, monotonous chant, and the congregation sat glossy-eyed, the words apparently making no impression. As for me, I was profoundly stirred. The remainder of the hour was torture, for I wanted to get out where I could think. Hurrying home to our bare little house, I found, with considerable difficulty, for I was not familiar with the Bible, that page from which the minister had read. There it was, in black and white, the exact process for achieving power to do, be, and have what you want. I experimented.
Nancy's face, sober and troubled, appeared at the door.
"Bobby," she said softly, "I don't like to leave you alone so long, but my patient seems to want a hand to hold. I'm afraid I must stay with him a little while."
"Quite proper," he agreed, with more than a glance at her. "Stay with him, and don't worry about me. I may have something very important to tell you when you come back. It looks as if the big mystery may be cleared up now at any minute." She hesitated and was about to ask a question, but seeing how complete was his absorption, withdrew and quietly closed the door. With that, Randolph handed me the magic page. Some 20 lines of it were heavily underscored in red ink. In silence, he puffed his pipe while my eye transversed the cryptic paragraphs, and when I looked up inquiringly, he said, "Of course, you will not realize the full importance of all this instantly. It seems simple because it was spoken dispassionately, with no oratorical bombast or prefatory warning that the formula he was about to state was the key to power." Edging his chair closer to mine, he laid a long hand on my knee and looked at me squarely in the eyes.
Dr. Hudson, if you had a small, inadequate brick house and decided to give yourself more room, what would you need for your building? More brick? If you had a small, inadequate steam engine, you would want more steel to construct larger cylinders. Not a different kind of steel to house a different kind of steam, but merely more room for expansion. Now, if you had a small, inadequate personality and wanted to give it a chance to be something more important, where would you find the building materials? He seemed waiting for a reply, so I humored him. Well, according to the drift of your argument, I presume I would have to build it out of other personalities. Is that what you're driving at? Precisely, he shouted. But not out of, into. Glad you said that, though, for it gives me a chance to show you the exact difference between the right and wrong methods of making use of other people's personalities in improving one's own. Everybody is aware, instinctively, that his personality is modified by others. Most people go about imitating various scraps and phrases of the personalities that have attracted them, copying one man's walk, another's accent, another's laugh, another's trick of gesture, making mere monkeys of themselves. This theory I am talking about. It doesn't ask you to build your personality out of other personalities, but into them. I'm afraid all that's too much for me, I admitted befuddledly. He rose and stamped back and forth in front of the grate, shaking his shaggy mop of grizzled hair, and waving his long-stemmed pipe as if trying to conjure a better explanation. See here, you know all about blood transfusion. That's in your line. Superb. One man puts his life into another man, Doctor. How do you accomplish a blood transfusion? Tell me in detail.
Merrick glanced as the door opened. Is he gone? Nancy nodded soberly.
What has been happening since I left? She asked, drawing up a chair beside him. He pushed his notes toward her and watched her face as she read. Just what is the best process of blood transfusion? Let's see how much you know.
Well, it's simple enough, except for one obstacle. The blood must be kept from coagulation as it passes from the donor to the recipient. Even when the artery and the vein are attached by a little cannula, the blood soon clogs the glass, so to avoid that stoppage, the vein of the recipient is passed through the cannula and cuffed back over the end of it. Then the cannula carrying the vein is inserted into the artery of the donor. The point is, you see, to ensure against any outside contact.
Bobby, what was on that page?
I haven't learned that yet.
Do you think he is going to tell us ever?
He's got to, sooner or later. Let's read on. I imagine we're close to it now.
Nancy took the pencil and began to copy from his rapid dictation.
I explained the principles of transfusion briefly, and Randolph seemed mightily pleased, especially with the feature of it which concerned the problem of coagulation.
Bright boy, Bobby, cried Nancy. You did know, didn't you?
He acknowledged her sally with a grimace and continued dictating. You will notice here, pointing to a page in my hand, that this first step toward the achievement of power is an expansion, a projection of oneself into another personalities. You will see that it has to be done with absolute secrecy, that if by any chance the contact is not immediate and direct, if by any chance there is a leak along the line of transfer, the whole effect of it is washed. You have to do it so stealthily that even your own left hand... Nancy tossed her pencil down on the desk and relaxed in her chair.
Bobby, I've got it. I can find the page.
Is there a Bible handy?
I'm afraid I haven't one, dear.
Well, then that can come later, then. Continue. Randolph returned to his chair and went on in a lowered voice. Hudson, the first time I tried it, I can tell you the incident freely because nothing ever came of it, although it had cost me more than I could afford at the time to do it. The chap was so grateful he told a neighbor of mine, in spite of my swearing him in. He had been out of work, and there had been a long run of sickness in the family, and he was just too shabby and down at the heel to make a presentable appearance in asking for a job. I outfitted him. He told it. A neighbor felicitated me next day. So there was more than $60 of my hard-earned cash squandered. Squandered, I shouted in amazement. How squandered? Didn't he get the job? Randolph sighed.
Oh, yes, he said. He found a job. I was glad enough for that, of course, but that didn't do me any good. You better believe the next time I made an outlay, I informed the fellow that if I ever heard of him telling anybody, I would break his neck.
Did you ever hear of anything more diabolical? Broke in Nancy indignantly. Can you imagine such fiendish selfishness? Just doing it to benefit himself, not even willing the other fellow should be grateful, and yet he thought he was getting himself connected with God that way. Gives you the creeps.
Well, keep in mind he's obsessed with a delusion.
Possessed of a devil, I'd rather believe.
Maybe Dr. Hudson will explain it. Let's proceed. He laughed merrily at the remembrance of the incident. The man thought I was crazy, he added, wiping his eyes. And you weren't? I inquired in a tone that sobered him. Really, it does sound foolish, doesn't it? I mean, when you first hear it, I don't wonder you're perplexed. I'm worse than perplexed, I admitted bluntly. I'm disgusted. You and me both, interpolated Bobby under his breath. You might as well be, admitted Randolph. If we were trying to get power that way, to stack up a lot of money for my own pleasure, all I wanted was the effective release of my latent ability to do something fine. And as for being disgusted because I requested the man not to tell anybody what I had done for him, if that offends you, you wouldn't like the Lord himself, for he often said that to people he had helped. I'm sorry I don't know, I said, not very well acquainted with what he said. Go ahead with your story. Thanks. But first let me lead you just a little further into the general philosophy of this. On the night of the day I made my first successful projection of my personality, I cannot tell you what it was. I dare not. I went literally into a closet at my house and shut the door. That's the next step in the program, as you have read there on that page. You see, I was very much in earnest about this matter, and having already bungled one attempt, I was resolved to obey the rules to the letter. Later, I discovered that the principle will work elsewhere than in a closet, just so you're insulated. Oh, Randolph, for God's sake, I exploded. What manner of wild talk is this?
Good, interrupted Nancy. It was high time he called him.
I confess I can't understand, said Randolph impatiently. Why you find this so hard to accept? Why, it's in line with our experience of every other energy we use. Either we meet its terms or we don't get the power. What did Volta's battery or Faraday's dynamo amount to, practically, until Dufay discovered an insulation that would protect the current from being dissipated through contacts with other things than the object to be energized? Most personalities are just grounded. That's all that ails them. So I went into a closet, shut the door, closed my eyes, quietly put myself into a spiritually receptive mood, and said confidently, addressing the major personality, I have fulfilled all the conditions required of me for receiving power. I am ready to have it. I want it. I want the capacity to do just one creditable work of statuary. Now, you may be inclined to believe that I experienced only a queer delusion at that moment. As a scientific man, you may think that my mental state can easily be accounted for by principles well known to psychology. If you think that, I have no objection. The fact that a process of achieving power by the expansion of the human personality admits of an explanation, in scientific terms, does not damage its value at all, in my opinion. I dare say the time will come when this matter is made a subject of scientific inquiry, but whether it is explicable or not, I can truthfully assure you that upon my finishing experiment in that closet, I received, as definitely as one receives a shock from an electrode, or a sudden glare of light by opening a tightly shuttered room, a strange inner illumination. It was late in the night. I came out of that dark, stifling little closet with a curious sense of mastery. It put me erect, flexed the muscles of my jaw, made my step resilient. I wanted to laugh. I tried to sleep, and, failing of it, walked the streets until dawn. At 8:30 I approached the manager of the factory and asked for 6 months' leave. When he inquired my reason, I told him I had it in my mind to attempt a piece of statuary. Something we might use, perhaps, he asked. I'm confident of it, I said, surprised at my own audacity. It was enough that I had determined to survive somehow without wages for 6 months. But now I had made an extravagant promise to the manager. He was thoughtful for a while and then said, I'll give you a chance to try it. For the present, you are to have your usual pay and a studio to yourself. If you produce something we can place, you will share in the sale. Your hours will be your own business. I should be glad if you succeeded. I began at once to work in a flutter of excitement. The clay seemed alive in my hands. The first day was a revelation. It was as if I had never really lived before. All colors were more vivid. I want you to remember that, Hudson. See if you have the same reaction. Grass is greener, sky is bluer. You hear the birds more distinctly. It sharpens the senses, like cocaine. That night, I went into my closet again and was immediately conscious of a peculiar intimacy between myself and that order. But it was not so dynamic as on the previous night. I decided that if I was to get any more power that way, I would have to make some further adjustments of my own spiritual equipment. That was on a Friday, the 10th of June. On the first day of September, I invited the manager in to see the cast I had made. He looked at it for a long time without any remark. Then he said quietly, I have some people who may be interested in this. It was the figure of a child, a chubby little fellow, about 4 years old. The boy was posed on one knee. He had just raised up from his play with a little dog that stood tensely alert in front of him, with a ball in his mouth, waiting for the child to notice him. The boy's shirt was open at the throat. His tight little knickers were buttoned to broad suspenders, and legs were bare to the knee. He was looking straight aloft, his little face all squinted up with baffled amazement, wonderment, curiosity. His small square hand shaded his eyes against a light almost too bright for him. The head tilted at an angle, indicating that he had heard something he could not quite understand and was listening for it to be repeated. The next afternoon, the manager's clients came in, a man and a wife. She was in black. They had recently lost their little boy. She cried at first, heartbreakingly, but after a while she smiled. It made me very happy when she smiled. I knew then that I had been able to express my thought. I was told to go on with my project and put it into white marble. Quite incidentally, the people adopted the boy I had used for a model. It was about 4 o'clock when I left Randolph's house that night. I was in a grand state of mystification. I went home resolved I would make an experiment similar to his. Before I went to bed, I tried to project my thoughts to some remote spiritual source, but was conscious of no reaction whatsoever. In the morning, I decided that I had been most outrageously imposed upon by an eccentric, and scowled at my own reflection in my shaving mirror. Nobody but a visionary could do these things with any hope of success, and I was, by training and temperament, a materialist, and a very cold-blooded one at that. At that day, however, I was aware of being on a quiet, unrelenting search for some suitable clinical material to be used for an experiment in the dynamics of personality projection. The strangest feature of my mood, however, was the fact that the power I had begun, rather vaguely, to grope for, under Randolph's urging, was not the mere satisfaction of an ambition to make myself important or minister to my own vanity. For the first time, my profession seemed to me not as a weapon of self-defense, but as a means of releasing myself. The last thing Randolph said to me at the door was this caution. Be careful how you get into this, my friend. I do not know the penalties this energy exacts when misused. I have no notion what dreadful thing might happen to the Galilean if he had turned these stones into bread. But I warn you, if you're thinking of going into this to feather your own nest, you'd better never give it another thought. I'm not sure, but I think it's terribly dangerous stuff to fool with. My own experiences are hereinafter set forth as possible aids to whomever has had the curiosity to translate this journal. I trust I have made it quite clear why I have chosen this peculiar method of passing it along. Had I ventured to report my experiments, it would have been at the expense of my reputation for sanity. I do not know of a single friend to whom I could have told these things without putting an unpleasant constraint between us. It has been a hard secret to keep. It is equally hard, I am discovering, to confide, even with the realization that these words are unlikely to be read during my lifetime. I dislike the idea of being thought a fool,
dead or alive, you, whoever you are, may be inclined to read on, perhaps personally interested in making an experiment, perhaps just curious. I wonder, would it be asking an unreasonable favor if you would not consent to stop at this point, if you are smiling? You see, some of these experiences of mine have meant a great deal to me, emotionally. I don't believe I should want them laughed at. If the thing hasn't gripped you a little by now, put it down, please, and think no more of it. If, however, you seriously wish to proceed, let me counsel you, as Randolph counseled me, that you are taking hold of high tension. Once you have touched it, you will never be able to let go. If you are of that temperament that demands self-indulgence to keep you happy and confident enough to do your work, and many inestimably valuable people are so built, and cannot help it any more than tall men can help being tall, leave all this alone and go your way. For if you make an excursion into this, you're bound. It will plaster a mortgage on everything you think you own, and commandeer your time when you might prefer to be using it for yourself. It is very expensive. It took the man who discovered it to a cross at the age of 33. Young Merrick pushed back the papers and turned slowly to face Nancy, but their eyes did not meet. They felt strangely embarrassed in each other's presence and sat for many minutes in silence. Bobby spoke. "Bound," he said. "Once you go into it, you're bound. Hudson has had me bound ever since he died. He should have been content with that." Nancy rose and rested her capable hands on his shoulders. "It's a good place to stop, wouldn't you say?" He agreed. Perhaps they might have an hour or two together tomorrow. He had half promised his grandfather he would be out for dinner. Tom Masterson had talked of going too. "Are you meaning to take the book along?" "I'll match you for it." "Heads." He slapped a coin on his wrist. "Sorry, Nancy. I'll bring it back tomorrow." Chapter 9. "Grandpere," said Bobby, slowly twirling the stem of his glass. "I wish you would tell Tom about the time you and Mr. Anderson butchered the pigs at the country club." The talk had been growing too serious. Masterson had an annoying tendency, when exhilarated, to become didactic. It was all clever enough, informative, interesting, but more dogmatic than suited the temper of a Thanksgiving dinner. By a circuitous route, they had arrived at a problem of a caste in America. Masterson conducting the excursion and pointing out the essential facts of interest to be noted along the way. Bobby was for a change of topic. Old Nicholas had some convictions on this subject. He would probably not express them to the same degree with which he believed them, but Masterson must not be encouraged to deliver himself of too many sentiments unshared by his genial host. "Why shouldn't there be a leisured class? Loafers, if you like that word better. This was about the only sign America had exhibited that she was maturing, ever so little, in the few restricted zones. Wasn't our brand of democracy dangerous? Referendum, huh? What did the average voter know? Every nation that had become great had achieved its distinction through the leadership of small social and intellectual minorities." Masterson was still talking. Hyde parking, almost a bit flushed about the temples. Bobby determined upon a change of subject. Old Nicholas was not in accord with many of young Masterson's views, but he liked his views better than the manner in which he delivered them, and liked both the views and the delivery better than the way he drank his wine. Meggs had been told to bring up a long-neglected bottle of choice Burgundy. In the opinion of the elder Merrick, wine like this deserved to be caressed, its color admired, its fragrance inhaled, its story reconstructed. It was to be sipped, drop by drop. It pleased him that Bobby seemed to know how. Liquid sunshine it was, sunshine that had warmed the pleasant banks of the Rhone in tranquil days before the war. One did not toss it off at a draught. Masterson gulped it. It was good to see Bobby close his eyes as his lips touched the rims of the glass, as if he saw merry groups of bare-legged little girls tramping it out in the shade at the corner of some provincial vineyard. The boy was maturing rapidly, reflected old Nicholas. He had the posture and gesture of a man.
Bobby occasionally insists upon this story, said Nicholas obediently. I have repeated it at his request many times.
And each time it is better, commented Bobby appreciatively.
Let's have it then, by all means, shouted Masterson,
much more boisterously than he had intended, an error he instantly endeavored to correct by bowing very formally and dignifiedly in an affirmative to Meg's unspoken query as the bottle was again tilted, tentatively, inquiringly over his glass. Meggs had tried to put into the gesture just the right degree of reserve, but the finesse was a bit too subtle for his customer.
Well, said Nicholas, clearing his throat, it was this way. You see, where Axion now stands, there used to be nothing but pasture fields. Joe Anderson and I, when we were kids, had a contract with most of the village folks to drive their cows out to pasture every morning in the summer and bring 'em home in the evening to be milked. Each cow was worth $1 a month to us. Out there in those fields, where we freckled-faced youngsters with stone bruises on our calloused feet sat all day, whittling kite sticks, playing mumble-peg, and bragging about the teams we captained at school. 3 Old Cat. You never played it, either of you. Joe and I later built a couple of big factories which quite changed the look of the landscape. These factories also brought changes in most people's mode of living. Many men who might have spent all their lives in ordinary financial circumstances came to have quite a little money. They built big houses, and their children took on heirs. And it was hard to recognize the place after a while, and even harder to recognize some of the people. Well, no matter how much absorbed we became in our business, Joe and I remained, through the years, just kids to each other. And I suppose it was a subject for many little jokes with other people. We kept our boyish relations, always bragging about our speed, strength, and endurance whenever we met, and invariably in the language we had used in the old days, like "Gee money crickets," and "Gosh darn it," and "For the love of Mike." It was rather silly, I'll admit, but we enjoyed it. Joe and I used to help our fathers with the hog butchering in November. Every family in those days had a few hogs in a pen. Time came when we were in our late teens that the annual slaughter was left pretty much to our management, and we usually combined forces, pulling it off at the Anderson place where they had better facilities for such work. We became quite expert butchers, and were very proud of our accomplishment. I dare say our fathers flattered us in the hope of making us too vain to see how glad they were to dodge the job. Well, one day after Joe and I had retired from our business concerns, we were having lunch together at the country club. It was a brand splinter new, had been open only a week. The only natural hazard on the golf course was a little stream where Joe and I used to fish for crawdads and minnies. Nobody ever said minnows. On the knoll where the new club was stood, there had been quite a nice little grove. Joe and I used to sit among those trees, on a log, slapping mosquitoes and watching for gray squirrels. He owned an old muzzle-loading shotgun, a mighty dangerous toy, too. Wondered we weren't killed a dozen times. We were having a good time, reminiscing. It seemed queer to be sitting there on that spot, lunching at a solid mahogany table sprinkled with Venetian doilies that slid about under crested silver. Everybody belonging to that club had plenty of money, and the clubhouse had been built and equipped without regard for expense. There was a lot of swank, too. And the servants seemed to have been let into the secret. This was one of our better clubs. The institution was by way of becoming a bit snobbish, we feared. Practically all the natives who belonged to it had been derived from quite humble origins, like Joe's and mine, and we worried a bit about the decline of the old democracy. It struck us that the mere fact of our having accidentally made a little money didn't require us to pretend we were of the British peerage. At adjoining tables sat some of the second growth crop of Axionites, male and female, talking about polo and derbies and regattas and bearits and grouse in Scotland, and we thought the general tone of the place should be improved, so we fell to discussing some of the good old times the Axiom boys and girls used to have before the automobiles came along and scared the horses off the roads, drove the cows out of the pastures to make room for the golfers. Then one of us remembered about the butchering. Joe recalled that one time we put on a contest to see which of us could dress a hog in the shortest time. I recalled the incident perfectly, but was sure I had won the small stake we'd put up. Joe disputed me so strongly that the neighboring tables became interested and presently alarmed. When we observed that we had collected quite a sizable audience, we obligingly continued our debate, chiefly for their benefit. The upshot of the argument was that Joe and I had bet $1,000 aside that each of us could dress a hog in less time than the other. The old chaps, when they heard of it, insisted that the contest be held in the grill room, and a book was made, which, I learned afterwards, involved bets running into scandalous sums. The engagement was put on the club calendar, and I'm not sure it was pointed to with much pride by the younger set, but the old fellows seemed to want it there, and seeing their wishes really had to be consulted more or less, the polo crowd waived their objections. On the next Tuesday, after luncheon, no man went back to his office, if he had one. 2 live pigs, pretty good-sized ones, too, fetched in crated. A tarpaulin was spread on the grill room floor, and Joe and I, stripped to the skin, put on butcher's togs. We went through it, from squeal to sausage. I was told afterwards that the clubhouse had to be gone over from crypt to spire. They had grease on the stair-steps, and bristles in the soup, and cracklings in the rug for days thereafter. "Did it improve the democratic tone of the club?" asked Masterson, laughing. Old Nicholas shook his head and smiled. "No, I don't think so. Once you outgrow the simplicities, you can't recover them, or even remember them with any satisfaction. It's not far, from corn pone to plum pudding, but it's a long way back." "What do you make of our new second generation, Mr. Merrick?" inquired Masterson. "You mean yours and Bobby's, perhaps? Yours is the third, counting from where I am. Well, I presume there's more to be hoped for from yours than from the one that immediately preceded you." Nicholas's eyes strayed in Bobby's direction, and he continued, "There's a youngster, for example, preparing to be a doctor. His father at his age was an amateur deer slayer. When Cliff heard about this hog dressing episode, he was considerably excited. I said, 'But Cliff, I heard you bragging about skinning and curing a buck.' 'Oh, well,' he said, 'that was quite a different matter, and I expect it was,' he added generously, after a pause. Our family there was a trace of cynicism in Masterson's tone, has been curiously undisturbed by the problems incident to the accumulation of a large fortune. My father's the editor of a small-town paper in Indiana. His father was a country doctor, his grandfather a Methodist circuit writer. All the trouble that money has ever given us has been how to get enough of it to pay our bills, but so far as Bobby's concerned, he isn't running true to type at all. He's a biological, or should one say, a fiscal sport." Nicholas was meditative. "Well, yes, Bobby's case is, as you say, somewhat unusual." Masterson's corrugated brow signed that he was turning his kettle drums to this key, and would presently be holding forth again unless promptly checked. "Let's not bother to diagnose my case," protested Bobby, with an amicable growl. "Besides, I haven't done anything yet.
This is no time for serious talk. Grandpierre, how about telling Tommy the story of the time you and Mr. Anderson bet on which one of you could mow the most hay in an hour? Masterson furtively glanced at his watch and was caught at it by old Nicholas, who immediately pushed back his chair, ignoring Bobby's suggestion, and led the way toward the big drawing room, where he paused to toy with the music on the piano desk. What's this? Unfinished symphony, Bobby. Mind playing it for us? Not much in the mood for that one, Grandpierre. Too stuffed. We need something a bit livelier. How about this one? Neapolitan Nights? Pretty good, but it's rather soft and sticky, too, for a holiday celebration. Something with a lot of bang in it, then, said Nicholas, sinking with a satisfied sigh into a deep chair. Masterson edged up to Bobby and muttered under his breath, I say, do you think your grandfather would take it nicely if I ran along? I promised to look in later at Gordon's. There's a special little party on there tonight, a review. Wouldn't care to come along, would you? Who will be there? Everybody. The old gang that you snooted so damnably for months. Bobby was thoughtful for a moment, then, quite on impulse and greatly to Masterson's surprise, he said, I believe I will, Tommy. I'd rather like to see the bright lights again myself. It's been a good while. Masterson drummed nervously on the top of the piano. Recalling himself suddenly, he said with enthusiasm, Attaboy, old mole. Let's tell Grandpierre and hop. Just make the 8:25 in at midnight. Right time to be there. You weren't taking anybody, were you? Yes, Tom admitted hesitantly. That is, I had a tentative arrangement to pick up Joyce Hudson around midnight and drive her out. Provided it was quite agreeable, I should return from here. But there's no reason why you can't come with us, is there? Not so good. Don't care to horn in, but I'll run down with you and spend the night at Grandpierre's club. Have to be there in the morning anyway. Perhaps I'll drop in for a look at Gordon's. We'll see. Old Nicholas was glad enough to have done with both of them. So long as they stayed, he must be mindful of the sacred obligation as host. Late that afternoon, he had arrived at a most perplexing situation in the tragedy in stateroom 33, and was feverish to discover whether the pilot, whom the Count had tied up in the closet, would contrive to release himself and warn the American girl before the motor launch returned with the conspirators. Willing you should go, rumbled Nicholas as they scampered upstairs. Great snakes! Chapter 10. Gordon's. Gordon's the colorful. Gordon's the exotic. Gordon's at 2:30 in the morning. Brilliantly lighted, packed to suffocation, strangling in the smoke, sticky with sweat, shrill with gin, begotten of dirty messes in moldy cellars and proudly carried in monogrammed silver flasks, clamorous with the new music but lately imported duty-free from the headwaters of the Congo and brought to triumphant perfection by the highest-paid orchestra in the States, fresh from New York, where its engagement had been abruptly terminated by a padlock. Gordon's Gardens. Fiddles squeaked, saxophones squealed, oboes giggled, clarinets wailed, tubas yawped, triangles clanged. Lament of the damned? Perhaps. Not at all. I'm lonesome and blue for you. Bobby Merrick, waiting in the Rococo lobby for his coat check, listened with the ear of a man from Mars and drew a crooked smile. His coming had been quite on impulse. Long before the train had reached Detroit, he had made up his mind not to go out to Gordon's. The announcement of his decision had, he observed, eased the constraint that had fallen upon their talk. Tom had brightened visibly, though making gallant pretense of disappointment. I have a book that interests me, explained Bobby. I'd rather go to the club and read it than mill around with a lot of high school sheiks."
"And then there's your rheumatism, Uncle Dudley," smiled Masterson. "You ought to be careful at your age. Why don't you snap out of it?"
"No, I've graduated from all that stuff. It's the bunk. It's too depressing, Tommy. Everybody pretending. Little chap at the next table poking his fork occasionally into a cold dinner that cost him $17 for the two of them, half his week's wages. Hopping up with his mouth full to push Maisie around again through the wiggling pack, wishing he had the courage to ask her to marry him and wondering where he'd dig up $300 for a sparkler. Maisie wouldn't wear one that cost a nickel less. And that sad wail they danced to, though God knows, one can't blame Clarence for liking sad music. He's a sad young man. His credit's bad with his papa, and he's been drinking too much Dago mash."
"Have you ever thought of joining the WCTU?"
"Don't get peevish, Tommy. You run out to Gordon's and give him what you got for your last story, and I'll go read my book."
"That must be a fine damn book. What's its name?"
"Oh, it's a treatise by a medical man. You couldn't read it."
"Taking yourself rather seriously, aren't you?"
"Scalpulus is as jealous as Jehovah, my son." By consent, they had stopped ragging each other, and Bobby was asking interestedly about various members of the set from which his attention had lately been deflected. On mention of Joyce's name, he inquired casually, "Seeing much of her these days, Tommy?" Masterson nodded. "Serious?"
"I wish it might be thought so."
"Upstage with you, is she?"
"Quite. And you damned well know why."
"Nonsense. I haven't seen her for a whole year."
"Well, it isn't nonsense, not with her. You're very much on her mind, Doc."
Bobby repudiated the idea with the gesture. "Fine girl. Wish you luck, Tommy."
"Thanks. Go bump yourself off, and maybe I'll have it."
"By the way, Tommy, do you see something of the young Mrs. Hudson occasionally?"
"Of course. Gorgeous. Irreproachable and unapproachable. Goes nowhere. In the morning, you know. Southern old-school notions about weeds and all that. She'll come out of it one of these days and stir up a sensation. Lovely. Gad, don't know it, do you? Well, then you've never been anywhere and ain't seen nothing."
"Bad as that?" "I'll call sometime and give myself a treat."
"You'd better not. You've hard work to do and shouldn't be distracted."
The train groaned and ground into the ugliest station between Bombay and the Aurora Borealis, and they parted to hail taxis, promising each other an early meeting. Cordially welcomed and comfortably established at the Columbia Club, Bobby slipped out of his clothes and into the dressing gown to resume his work on the Hudson Journal. It was the beginning of a new chapter which took the reader into the author's confidence more intimately than before, as if, having met the latter way by the very act of proceeding with the translation, the legatee of the book was now on new terms of comradeship. It is important that you should know how serious are the conditions to be met by any man who hopes to increase his own power by the way of the technique I pursued under instructions from Randolph. I must mention them at this juncture because it is quite possible these words may be read by some impulsive enthusiast who, eager to avail himself of the large rewards promised, may attempt experiments from which he will receive neither pleasure nor benefit, and, dismayed by failure, find himself worse off in mind than he was before. Indeed, this was my own experience at first, Randolph having neglected to warn me that certain conditions were imperative to success. I learned them by trial and error. It must be borne in mind at the outset that no amount of altruistic endeavor, no matter how costly, can possibly benefit the donor if he has in any manner neglected the natural and normal obligations to which he is expected to be sensitive. Not only must he be just before attempting to be generous, he must figure this particular investment of himself as a higher altruism, quite other than mere generosity. Every conceivable responsibility must have had full attention before one goes in search of an opportunity to perform secret services to be used for the express purpose of expanding one's personality, that it might become receptive to that inexplicable energy which guarantees personal power.
My own life had been set in narrow ways. I had had but small chance to inure or defraud. Even I had been of a scheming disposition. There had been the minimum of buying and selling in my program. I had lived mostly under strict supervision, in school, in college, and as an intern, with no chance to make many grave or irretrievable blunders. Once I began to discharge my obligations, however, it was startling to note how considerably I was in the red. For example, I found that there were a good many men, scattered here and there, who had been scratched off my books. Either actually, or to all practical intents, they had been told to go to hell. In some cases, there had been enough provocation to justify my pitching them out of life, I thought, but more often than otherwise they were to be remembered as persons with whom I had sustained some manner of close contact, close enough to make a disruption possible. I discovered that almost without exception the people I had pushed away from me, consigned to hell if you like, were once intimately associated with me. So far as I was concerned, they had gone to hell, taking along with them a very considerable part of me. To lose a friend in one whom had invested something of one's personality was, I discovered, to have lost a certain amount of oneself. The successful pursuit of the philosophy now before you demands that you restore whatever of your personality had been dissipated, carted off by other people. If any of its essential energy has been scattered, it must be recovered. The original proposer of this theory, aware of the importance of insuring against such losses, advised that all misunderstandings should be settled on the spot. When an estrangement takes a friend out of your normal contacts with him, he leaves with part of you in his hand. You must gather up these fragments by yourself, by some hook-crook, so that you have at least all of the personality that rightfully belongs to you before you attempt its larger projection. In the next place, you make the mistake of seeking far and wide for opportunities to build yourself into other personalities through their rehabilitation. A happy circumstance kept me from doing that. Strangely enough, the first really important service I was permitted to do, prefatory to experimenting with this mysterious dynamic, was for the daughter of the man who had shown me the way to it. I risked what small repute I had, and put a mortgage on whatever I might hope to acquire by the performance of an operation that saved her life, and, quite incidentally, brought me 3 pages of comment in the next edition of the Medical Encyclopedia. Bobby left his papers as they were, dressed carefully, called a taxi, and proceeded to Gordon's. He had no one definite answer to give him to himself for a sudden decision. If queried, he would have to say that there came a moment when he felt he was needed at Gordon's. Certainly he was not going in quest of pleasure. His arrival at the famous cabaret could not have been better timed. An hour earlier, he would have found a noisy, chaffing welcome at a table of silly and excited friends hoping of seeing him, as drunk as themselves, half resentful of his appearance sober. Because it was a festival night, the cabaret's bill of amusements was more elaborate than usual. The girl chorus, obviously much the worse for the holiday hospitality, during intermissions they were accorded many courtesies at the tables of diners, were softly caterwauling the refrain of a popular opera song, while a huge fellow, open-shirted, velvet-trousered, and bandanaed in a bandit roll, held the spotlight with a solo dance. Aleppo was the headliner on the bill, primarily an acrobat and strong man, with fancy dancing and a bit of florid song to supplement his feats of agility and strength. Aleppo's versatility was acknowledged with tumultuous applause. Smug satisfaction and self-assurance were spelled in every line of his swarthy face as he executed his intricate dance steps. Bobby waited just inside the entrance until the number should be finished. He was too far from the stage to hear Aleppo's announcement. Sometime afterwards, he learned that the CAD had called for a volunteer dancing partner from the audience. A tall blonde in blue chiffon was unsteadily mounting the steps to the stage. She lurched into the big dancer's arms, and he swung her into rhythm with him in a fast and furious foxtrot. The girl was Joyce Hudson. The crowd cheered them lustily. The orchestra took fresh interest. The chorus receded to give them room. Eager to offer a final thrill to his audience, the huge Aleppo lifted his amateur teammate to his shoulder. No one but an inexperienced acrobat could have met the situation gracefully. Aleppo continued to spin about the stage with light steps. His burden meant nothing to him. Dizzily drunk, Joyce swayed, clutched at Aleppo's shaggy head for support, and sank back limply over his shoulder while he, with big muscled arms encircling her knees, revolved like a top, quite as if the act had been rehearsed, and he need have no concern about his partner's safety. Joyce's hair stood straight from her head, and her arms wildly groped as the rapid revolutions of the dancer whirled her through the air. Bobby could not remember later how he arrived at the stage. There was some ruthless elbowing through the crowd, chairs upset, tables pushed aside as he made his way. He ran up the steps and, confronting the dancer with an outstretched arm, commanded him to stop. His face was grim and pale. With an ironical smile, Aleppo eluded the intruder, and Bobby rushed. Pandemonium broke loose among the tables, and the diners jostled about the foot of the stage. Tom Masterson forced his way through the crowd, climbed the steps, and clutched at Bobby's sleeve. "The hell's the matter with you?" he screamed. "If Joyce wants to have a bit of fun with this fellow, what business is it yours?" The orchestra had stopped. Aleppo put Joyce down, and she crumpled on the floor. Several girls from the chorus bent over her. One ran for water. With a pugilistic swagger, Aleppo strode forward. His beady little eyes flashed dangerously. His pugnacious jaw seemed coming along somewhat in advance of him. His big fists were clenched. Baring his teeth in a crooked grin, he snarled, "Now! You're so damned anxious to get into trouble." "Look out!" shouted Masterson. "Don't do that!" "Sock him!" yelled some youngster from the crowd. Aleppo advanced belligerently until he was within reach of a surprise. There were 3 quick, crunching blows in his face, a right to his left eye, a left to his right eye, and a right to the point of his chin. The big fellow's knees buckled under him, and he collapsed without a sigh. It was very quiet at Gordon's for a moment. Everybody was stunned by the sudden turn of events. Roughly pushing Masterson aside, Bobby turned to Joyce, stood and gathered her up in his arms, and started down the steps of the stage, the crowd falling back to make way for him. "Just a minute," shouted Masterson, pursuing him. "I'll take care of her. You needn't be so officious." Bobby turned towards him and said in a low voice, "You should have taken care of her a little sooner." Masterson was in a drunken rage over his humiliation. "Well, if you think you can get away with that—" He clutched Bobby's throat, ripping off his collar, clawed at his hair. His cufflink dug deeply into his friend's cheek, and the blood flowed freely, dripping from his jaw to his shirt bosom. Supporting his limp charge with his left arm, Bobby let loose a short-arm jab at the pit of Masterson's none too able stomach, which demoted him to the ranks of the non-combatants, and, taking Joyce again in his arms, marched forward, pushing chairs and tables out of the way with their bodies. At the door, the burly-headed waiter barred his progress. "Did you bring this young lady here?" "No, but I am taking her away." "Well, not so fast. Let's look into this." Again, Bobby lowered Joyce's feet to the floor, steadied her with his left arm, and he growled, "Open that door. I have no intention of mixing it with anybody here else tonight, but if you try to stop me, I'll put you to sleep alongside your little friend up there." The bruiser hesitated. Someone shouted, "Let him go before the joint gets pinched. He'll see her home. Here, take her coat." The crisp blast of cold air swept Joyce back to partial consciousness. A waiting taxi drove up under the porte cochere. Bobby lifted her in, told the grinning driver to head east on the boulevard, and he'd let him know presently where they wanted to go, and seated himself beside her. Confusedly, she recognized him, looked up dully into his face, and mumbled thickly, "Oh, Bobby, you came at last, didn't you? I waited so long. I've wanted you so. She nestled her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, spared the necessity of replying, for her revival was brief. In a moment she slumped and slept. Now he'd got her, what should he do with her? It occurred to him that he might take her someplace and sober her up before presenting her at home, an idea he instantly rejected. She wouldn't be even approximately normal for hours. Joyce was drunk, and no mistake. Had he really done her a good turn with his swashbuckling excursion into her affairs? Perhaps it would result in more damaging notoriety for her than she had been left to go on her own gait. Could he and Tom Masterson ever be friends again? Doubtful. The driver turned his head for definite instructions, and Bobby gave Joyce his address. He'd have to take her home. Maybe he could put her into the house without stirring it up. He shook her awake as they neared the corner. "Joyce, where's your house key?" She began to fumble with her coat, and acting on the clue, he discovered it in an inside pocket. The taxi drew up at the curb, and the driver obeyed his fare's order to shut off the engine and wait. Rousing as the cold air rushed in through the open door, Joyce twined her arms about Bobby's neck and kissed him on the cheek. He was bleeding, but she was too far gone to notice. It was easier to carry than drag her. The front door was quickly reached, opened, and closed quietly. He remembered the appointments of the house. Depositing her on the davenport in the living room, he drew off her slippers and covered her with a heavy steamer rug. Her face was bloody. That would undoubtedly call for explanations which would drag out the whole story, adding even more discredit to her plight and more chagrin to someone else whose dignity better deserved protection. Presuming there must be a lavatory on the main floor, he looked about for it, and having made experimental forays into 2 cloak closets, finally discovered the little washroom off the library, dampened a towel, and was on his way back with it when he heard a throaty voice that had never quite left his consciousness. It so completely bridged the weeks that it seemed to take on exactly where it had left off. "Good night, then, and thank you so much." "Joyce, you've been hurt." There was no reply, and a moment's silence. Doubtless she was noticing the light in the library. Perhaps she had observed his coat tossed across a chair. He decided not to be caught in ambush. They met at the door. She seemed not quite so tall as he remembered her, possibly because the little red and black slippers had lower heels. The disarray of her bobbed head, her tousled bangs, made her look like a child suddenly roused from sleep, to which juvenile effect her suit of Japanese pajamas contributed, black with red poppies buttoned high about her throat. Bobby was aware of the exquisiteness of her ensemble, but all that he saw distinctly was her bewildered blue eyes searching his with mystification. On sight of him, she gasped with surprise, put the back of her hand to her lips as if warding off a blow, stared inquiringly at his blood-smeared cheek. "Why, it's you," she whispered. "Whatever are you doing here?" "I brought Joyce home. I'm sorry I startled you. I'd rather hoped we might not have to disturb you." "But I thought she was going away with Mr. Masterson. Was he hurt? You've been, I see. Was there an accident?" "Something like that. Nothing serious at all. Joyce isn't hurt. She's just pretty tired and sleepy." "Her face is bloody. You were going to do something about it, I notice." He handed her the towel. "You'll find she's not hurt. That blood she rubbed off me when I brought her in. I thought I would wash it off so you wouldn't be alarmed when you saw her." For a long moment they stood, gazing appraisingly into each other's eyes, hers wide with curiosity, hurt with disappointment, but half sympathetic. His eloquent with appeal for suspended judgment.
both of them at a loss for words to meet their predicament, unable to release themselves from this speechless recognition of their brief comradeship's claims. So, you knew you were coming to my house then? Perhaps you'll tell me who you are. You didn't say that other time. Into Helen's eyes, and an instant afterwards upon her lips, there came the suggestion of a smile. Bobby hesitated, then blurted out, "Merrick." "So you're Bobby Merrick." Her eyes narrowed. She dug her little fists into her ribs with a defiance that would have seemed deliciously absurd had the occasion been less serious, for she had not been naturally cast for tragic roles, and her costume was everything but militant. "You hadn't brought us enough trouble, had you? What we'd been through wasn't quite sufficient? You must add a little humiliation to it? You brought Joyce home to me drunk? You look as if you'd been drinking too. Fighting, were you? If you could only see yourself. Oh!" "Yes, I know. I'm not very pretty to look at, and the evidence isn't good. Joyce will tell you all about it in the morning. Meant it all right. Sorry." "You'd better go now." He caught up his topcoat. "It's too bad," he muttered, half to himself as he passed her. As if he were already out of the house, Helen sank down on the davenport at Joyce's feet, put both her hands over her face, and cried like a little child threatened with punishment. It was a devastating scheme. She seemed so pitiably alone, so desperately in need of a friendly word. With arrested step, Bobby regarded her with a deeper compassion than he had ever experienced. Swept again with that strange sense of their belonging, he turned and took a hesitating step toward her. Suddenly aware of him and divining his thoughts, she slowly shook her head. "No. There's nothing you can do for us. But go." Her voice was torn with pity. "I can't leave you this way. Am I to remember you always, sitting in a crumpled little heap crying because I had hurt you?" He bent over with his extended hand. "Say good night to me, won't you?" Her eyes traveled up to his face. "You're still bleeding," she said dully. "Better do something. Go in there and wash it off." Tossing aside his coat, Bobby returned to the little lavatory, disinterestedly mopped at his stains and flung down the towel bitterly. She was waiting in the open doorway when he turned, leaning limply back against the doorpost, face upturned, eyes closed, with a roll of surgical bandage, adhesive tape, and scissors in her hands. "You're mighty thoughtful." He reached for the dressings. "Not at all," she said evenly, ignoring his gesture. "I'd do as much for a hurt dog. I was too upset to notice that you really needed attention. Come over here to the light. I'll try to fix you." He followed her to the table. With deft fingers she shaped a gauze pad, sheared off some strips of tape, and gave her attention to his torn cheek with all the impersonal interest of a veteran nurse in a charity clinic. The sleeves of her jacket slipped back as she reached up. The touch of her hands on his face, the warm nearness of her, the little tremulous catch in her throat when she breathed, set his heart racing furiously. "There," she said at length, lifting the longest lashes he had ever seen and looking inquiringly into his eyes. "Does that feel better?" Hours afterward, when her tempest of indignation had subsided through sheer fatigue, her self-reproaches began to eclipse the scorn she felt for him. Exquisitely tortured, she had lived it over and over again, every second of it, for it had all happened swiftly, as one who follows the minutiae of motion on a slow film. Perhaps, had she turned away at once, he might have stammered his appreciation and left. How indignant of her to have looked up at close range to inquire with honest solicitude.
Does that feel better?
It felt so much better, apparently, that he must express his thanks by taking her hand, as it was withdrawn from his face, lifting it quickly to his lips. She jerked it away from him angrily. Later, as she thought it over in her chaos of angry shame, she reflected it would have been better had she submitted dignifiedly to his impulsive gesture of gratitude and signed him to be off. He stood humiliated, abased, as if she had struck him a blow. Then huskily, measuring his words, he said, "I wonder if you would have done that to a hurt dog. Grateful for a little unexpected kindness." What a slyly mean advantage to have taken of her sympathy, of her instinctive courtesy.
That was awfully rude of me. I've been through a lot tonight. I'm not quite myself. Please, go. Now.
She should have commanded, not entreated. "I know you have been cruelly troubled, and it nearly breaks my heart," he had said. As she milled it over, with her flushed face buried deep in her pillow, she tried to explain how it all happened. For an instant, when he had put his arms gently about her, she forgot that he was Bobby Merrick. Bobby Merrick was just some mythical person she didn't want to know. She remembered only that this was the quiet, pensive, lovable chap who had led her like a little child along a dark country lane, and she was so desolately lonely and in need of tenderness. He softly touched her wet eyes with his handkerchief. How could she have stood there, calmly submitting to his impudent attentions? What had she been thinking of to allow herself to be placed in such an impossible predicament? What a beast he had been to make capital of her yearning for a bit of human kindness at a moment when he knew her whole world was breaking up under her feet. Well, he surely was made aware before he left what she thought of his despicable treatment of her. Hadn't she told him, so bitterly, so scathingly, that he had cringed under it? But that was small balm for her injured pride. She had actually stood with her forehead pressed against his arm, with his slim fingers caressing her hair, utterly unable to exert her will, dreamily visioning a thin trickle of fine sand pouring into a small red-brown heap at the bottom of an hourglass, and wondering how to shut it off. Why, she must have been hypnotized. "Won't you forgive me, now?" he whispered. Why couldn't she have freed herself, smiled, agreed in a matter-of-fact tone?
"I'll not hold anything against you. Good night,"
she repeated into her pillow several variants of that commonplace, devoutly wishing she could remember having said it, trying to persuade herself she really had. But he had pleaded so wistfully. She had lifted her eyes, and her lips were parted to speak a single word of friendly assurance when it happened. And she had offered no resistance. Oh, how cheap he must think her. How little respect he had had for her, widowed because of him. And worst of all, he would probably be cad enough to imagine that she had responded to his kiss. It was the haunting fear he might think she had shared it that tortured her most. Of course, she had done what she could, quickly, savagely, to reinstate herself in his regard. Breaking free, she had pushed him from her, forbade him ever to speak to her again, left the room in a grand state of emotional tumult without so much as pausing to glance at the stupefied Joyce, heavily sleeping through a scene that could not have failed to interest her had she been aware of it. Seated before her mirror at 9, gazing remorselessly at her haggard reflection, she straightened stiffly and said aloud,
"Well, whatever he may care to think, I'm certain I didn't."
Sleepy servants at the Columbia Club grinned and exchanged winks when Bobby arrived at 4:15, sullen and disheveled. "Teddy," he growled to the elevator boy, "bring me a bottle of scotch and a siphon of soda." He disrobed, mixed a stiff drink and another, and a third, in swift succession, scowled hatefully at himself in the bathroom mirror, and muttered, "Piker!" He had forfeited the thing he most wanted. The only thing he wanted in this world. Now, she would never consent to see him again. She had said it, and she meant it. He had imposed upon her kindness, had stampeded her into an impetuous response to his sympathy, which she would regret with self-loathing. What was the good of anything now? The Hudson Journal lay on the desk where he had left it, a sheaf of club stationery beside it, scrawled with rows of letters. He gave the book a contemptuous push with the back of his hand, and it fell into the wastebasket. "Damned silly nonsense," he muttered. "To hell with all that kind of blah." Chapter 11. "Please be seated, Mr. Merrick," the secretary had said stiffly 20 minutes ago. "Dean Whitley is busy now." A qualitative analysis of Mr. Merrick's scowl as he sat fidgeting would have resolved it into 2 parts curiosity, 3 parts anxiety, and the remainder annoyance. Of chagrin, a trace. The note had said 11, and he had entered while the clock was striking. It had not specified what the dean wished to see him about. That would have been too much to expect. Courtesy and consideration were against the rules governing the official actions of deans. Big universities, like monopolistic public utilities and internal revenue offices, enjoyed high-hatting their constituencies, liked to make an impressive swank with their authority, liked to keep people waiting, guessing, worrying, liked to put 'em to all the bother possible. Mr. Glarick glowered. He glowered first at the large photograph of an autopsy suspended above the secretary's desk in the corner. 7 doctors owling it over a corpse. All of the doctors were paunchy, their pendulous chins giving them the appearance of a covey of white pelicans. They were baggy under the eyes, a lot of fat ghosts swathed in shrouds. The corpse, too, was fat. Why conduct a post over this bird? Any layman could see at a glance what had ailed him. He was a glutton. Let these wiseacres take warning in the presence of this plump cadaver and go on a diet of curds and spinach before some committee put them on a stone slab and rummaged in their cold, capacious bellies to enhance the glory of materia medica. They were the bunk, the whole greasy lot of them. Having temporarily finished with the autopsy, Dean Whitley's impatient customer glowered over the titles of the big books and the case hard by Simpson's Nervous Diseases, the old sap. He had to read his blather in front of a dictionary. Weren't 10 words in the whole 14 pounds of wood pulp with less than 7 syllables. Mount's obsessions. Why was it that these bozos thought it unscholarly to be intelligible and undignified to be interesting? And as for obsessions, old Mount was a nut himself, one of these cuckoos who had tapped every 3rd telegraph pole with his cane and spat on fire plugs. If he missed one, he had to go back, it was said, about the same mentality as Fido's. Well, Mount ought to be an authority on obsessions. A tall, rangy medic came out of the dean's sanctum, very red but with a jaunty stride, crossed the room in 4 strides and banged the door. But it was no new experience for that door. Distracted from his invoice of the bookshelf, Mr. Merrick glowered at the bony maiden who rattled the typewriter. Smug and surly she was, mouth all screwed up into an ugly little rosette, lashless eyes snapping, sharp nose sniffing. Easy to see what she was doing, writing a letter to some poor boob, inviting him to come in at 9 and see the dean. She ought to add a postscript that he would be expected to spend half of a fine June morning in this dismal hole, waiting for his nibs to finish the free press in his nails, take his legs off the table, and push a buzzer to let the beggar in. "Dean Whitley will see you now, Mr. Merrick." "Mr. Merrick," said Dean Whitley, after Bobby had taken the chair recommended to him, "I must have a friendly chat with you.
During the first few weeks of the last semester, you gave promise, I am informed, of an exceptionally interesting career in the medical profession. Shortly after the mid-semester examinations, which I see you passed with the highest marks of your class, you began to slip. You quickly used up all your cuts. You became disinterested and disgruntled. What's the trouble?
I think you'll be fine. I've been doing average work, sir.
Dean Whitley shook a long, bony finger. Exactly! Average work. Do you hanker to be an average doctor?
Well, when you put it that way, of course not.
The dean tilted back in his swivel chair and clasped his hands behind his head. Your case is somewhat unusual, Merrick. You're the heir apparent to a large fortune. You do not have to seek a vocation. It was a surprise to all your friends that you came here. Your line of least resistance was polo, but you plunged into your work with an enthusiasm that put the whole first-year class on its toes and challenged the instructional corps to offer the best it had. Now, precisely what has happened to your spirit? Is there anything we can do to put you in the running again? Bobby twisted the links of a platinum watch chain, head hanging.
You're quite right, Dean Whitley. I suppose it was the novelty that kept me alive at first.
Yes, but see here. The dean reversed the sheaf of tabulations and pushed it across the table. Just follow that line from opening day to the Thanksgiving recess, and there isn't a cut. You didn't flick a class. Pursue it the rest of the way and see what you did to your scholastic credit. What happened to you on or about Thanksgiving? Perhaps you should be treated for it, whatever it was. You're too promising to lose if we could save you.
I just got tired of it. Too much drudgery.
It wasn't drudgery before.
Well, I think I began to notice that it was about that time.
Ever think giving it up?
Oh, no, sir. I can't do that.
Why not? You don't aspire to be a mere second-rater, do you?
I suppose I'll have to content myself with that. I'll have plenty of company, won't I?
The dean fiddled with the paper knife and looked down his nose glumly. This is very disappointing. Sure you don't want to give me your full confidence? Let me try to help you.
Bobby moved to the edge of his chair and took up his hat. There's nothing you can do, sir. Thank you for your interest. I'll try to do better. On the front steps he met Dawson, a first-year medic with whom he had a mere nodding acquaintance. Dawson was a lean-faced, hollow-eyed, shabby chap who had a desperate time of it trying to keep up. Slightly older than the average, more was expected of him than he was able to deliver. Not infrequently he was scornfully panned by his instructors who seemed to enjoy watching him wince under their satirical jabs. A question, having been muffed by 3 or 4, would be tossed at him in such a fashion as, "And of course you wouldn't know, would you, Mr. Dawson?" 7 times out of 9, he wouldn't. Bobby's sympathy had been excited occasionally. What were they trying to do to the poor devil? Drive him into the river?
Hello, Merrick. Been deanin'?
Oh, yes, said Bobby brightly. But not in the way you probably suspect. You see, the dean and I meet frequently for a game of cribbage. He's good, too. I presume you're having tea with him presently? Dawson was grim.
Nah. I'm going in to tell him I'm through. They can all go to hell.
That would be a great blunder, Dawson. Bobby became owlishly didactic. They might go, and where would that leave you? You see, my son, every time you send a man to hell with whom you have had close personal contacts, he takes a part of you along with him. And then, some fine day, when things are ever so much better with you, and you need to collect all there is of your scattered personality for some noble purpose, a considerable chunk of you is missing, and you'll have to go to hell after it.
That's a big idea. Trying to kid me? If so, don't. I'm in no mood for it. Up to the last ditch. If you don't mind my weeping on your neck.
How about a bite of lunch together? Suggested Bobby, amazed at his own proposal of hospitality to this morose, threadbare fellow. All you're seeing him for is to tell him to go to hell. Put it off till tomorrow. He won't object to the delay. Yielding with a crooked smile to Bobby's persuasion, Dawson fell into step. "Anything you'd like to get off your chest?" inquired his host after their order had been given. "Perhaps you'd enjoy singing a few verses of your Hymn of Hate. If so, go to it, and I'll join you in the chorus where the fancy damning comes in."
"Thanks, Merrick. You're a good sort. Perhaps it wouldn't be bad for me to let off steam. I'll tell you a little bit about it. I always wanted to be a surgeon. Prattled about it as a child. Never thought of anything else. Thought of it as a novitiate in holy orders thinks of his vocation. After college, I was out for 3 years trying to scrape up enough to bring me back. Got discouraged. Gave it up. Fell in love. Married. The girl revived the old hope in me. Worked like dogs, both of us. She in an office, I selling bonds. So we came last September. She found a job. Then the baby came. A lot of expenses. Living was higher than we figured. I began to work downtown nights in a bowling alley, setting pins for freshmen to knock down one at a time. How's that for your inferiority complex?
Well, it certainly wouldn't drive a man into a state of hallucinatory omnipotence, that's sure.
A woolly caterpillar. That's what it made of me. No wonder I was a dunce. And now, as if I hadn't already enough to... But hell, what's the good of talking about it?
"Drive on," commanded Bobby. "It's no further through to the other side than to back out. Let's have the rest of it. You were a caterpillar and a dunce, and now you're something else again? What's happened lately?"
My wife is sick. No, nothing acute, just fagged and undernourished and neurotic. Says she's a dead weight on me and wishes she were dead. She's brooding over it. I'm half afraid to go home for fear I'll find that she has destroyed herself.
"She should be out in the country for the summer," advised Bobby. "Fresh air, good milk, sunshine."
"Might as well suggest a trip to Europe," muttered Dawson. "We've nothing."
"Hasn't she people she could go to for summer?"
"Nobody. There's a tight old stepfather who threw her out when she married me. He'd picked a yokel for her who lived in the neighborhood. My mother is a widow, living with my sister upstate. They're poor, too, and crowded."
"How about a little loan? You're not always going to be on your uppers. Almost anybody would consider that a safe investment, I should think."
"I don't know anyone I could approach with a proposition like that."
Bobby's guest ate hungrily. His hand trembled when he cut his meat. "I have a little money that isn't in use just now."
Dawson shook his head. "No! Oh, my God! I didn't tell you my story with the hope of panhandling some money out of you. You're probably like all the rest of the medics, just scraping along. Thanks all the same, old man. It's mighty generous of you. No, I'm going to give it up and get a job."
"You didn't understand me, Dawson. I didn't mean to propose handling you the price of next week's groceries. I'd like to lend you, say, $5,000. Here was one chap that had accepted him as a pal in poverty. Natural enough, though. Dawson had had his nose to the grindstone, kept aloof from the others. He needn't have heard that there was a wealthy student in the class, and this interview had not been of his seeking.
"You mean that?"
"Of course. You didn't think I'd joke with you about a business matter involving $5,000, did you?" Bobby would never have suspected the fellow of so much sparkle and spontaneous wit. He expanded as if some miracle had been performed on him.
"Merrick,"
he said solemnly as they reached the street.
"You've come near saving a couple of lives today. Mind if I run home now? I've got to tell her. I say, wouldn't you like to come along?"
There were a shabby pair of rooms on the third floor of a third-rate apartment house over north of the big hospital, disorderly, with the clutter incident to an attempt to make a bedroom, dining room, nursery, and kitchen of such cramped quarters. Marion Dawson had no apologies to offer for the appearance of her house. Bobby liked her for that. He was instantly delighted with this pale, tawny-haired, hazel-eyed young woman who gave him a man's hand grip and unloaded a chair for him without a flurry of embarrassment. The baby was dug up for inspection and greeted the visitor with big, blinking eyes, amusingly like his father's. Having had no experience with babies, Bobby regarded this one with something of the same solemn interest it bestowed on him. Marion laughed. "You get acquainted with him that way," she exclaimed. "You gotta boo at him or something. He expects it, you know. He wouldn't think of making a little ass of himself by booing at you, but he'll be dreadfully disappointed if you don't make some idiotic noises at him." Bobby knew he was going to like this girl. "Marion," said Dawson with an unsteady voice, "Mr. Merrick is going to lend us some money. He says we're a good risk. I'm not sure about me, but I know you are." She dropped her air of banter and stared at their guest for a long moment, trying to realize the significance of her husband's announcement, then said, with deep feeling, "So, after all we've been through, Jack is to have his chance at last." She put a hand on his shoulder. "Dear boy, it's been so long, so hard for you." She reached out her left hand to Bobby and clasped his with grateful fingers. "What a lovely thing for you to do," she said. "Oh, everybody has his troubles," stammered Bobby, hoping the situation would be spared a debauch of sentimentality. "Least trouble in the world is a shortage of money."
"Unless one hasn't any," chuckled Dawson.
Bobby arrived late in the little amphitheater of the surgical clinic that afternoon. The operation proved of exceptional interest. He found himself leaning far forward. That night, he almost enjoyed his brill. Before he went to bed at 1, he wrote to Nancy Ashford, to whom he had owed a letter for weeks. "I had a very interesting visit today with a young medic and his wife, the Dawsons," his second page began, but after looking at the words critically for a moment, he crumpled the page and started a fresh one with no mention of the Dawsons. "Have you deciphered the rest of the journal?" He sent it back to her with the brief statement that he didn't care to bother any further with. He wasn't the right type to pursue any such philosophy with hope of pleasure or profit, he said, and it really wasn't sporting to read it for curiosity's sake, especially after Dr. Hudson's request that one stop when one's personal interest had flagged. "Perhaps you will tell me, at least in a general way, how it all came out of if you completed it. I learn in reading about unusual obsessions that a marked mystical tendency occasionally shows up in the minds of very materialistic people who deal practically, otherwise, with all their interests. I dare say Dr. Hudson was a typical case." 2 days later, he had her reply. "Mrs. Hudson has the journal now, along with all the other things we kept for her in the office safe. I doubt if she has made any effort to discover what it's all about. Perhaps she hasn't opened the box in which she received them. At all events, she has not queried me, as she might have done if she had been mystified by the code. I feel confident she would let you have the book now that your interest in it is revived. Yes, I deciphered the rest of it. An amazing record. If it were done into a book, it would sell 100,000. People would pronounce it utterly incredible, of course, but they would read it. I'd heartily wish it were true. And I have a notion they would be sneaking off to make experiments, no matter how they might have giggled when discussing the theory with their friends. I wish I dared tell you, you know why I cannot, about the quite startling experiences I myself have had lately. It's all true, Bobby. You do get what you want that way, if what you want contributes to the larger expression of yourself in constructive service.
You even get letters that had been so long delayed you wondered if you had been forgotten. Does that sound foolish?
It sounded foolish. I'm sorry, mused Bobby, folding the letter. Nancy had such an interesting mind. Now she'll be goofy for the rest of her life. Glad I stopped that bally nonsense before it got me.
He smiled bitterly over Nancy's suggestion that he ask Mrs. Hudson for the journal. His contrite note of apology, dated December 1st, had not been answered. For the first 2 weeks, he had shadowed the postman. On the Sunday morning that young Mrs. Dawson and the baby were taken to the country, Bobby, on pressing invitation, joined the party. The place they had chosen was a quiet cottage owned by a middle-aged widow, a few hundred yards from the shady shore of Pleasant Lake, an hour's railroad trip to the north. Relieved of his long anxiety, Jack Dawson had lost his pallor. His step was elastic. His shoulders were squared. As for Marion, she was radiant. They made a picnic of it and ate their lunch on the lakeshore. Jack, Jr., left in the custody of Mrs. Plimpton, who immediately on being alone with him decided he would be all the better for a bit of old-fashioned rocking and a few gospel sounds.
"Now, none of that," declared Marion, setting out the contents of their basket. "You two old doctors have plenty of chances to talk wisely about disabled gizzards all through the week. It makes me sick to eat my meals off the operating table anyway."
Apparently they had known nothing of Bobby's wealth before he had interested himself in them. Doubtless they knew now. But the Dawsons' attitude toward him was unchanged. There was not a trace of shyness or sycophancy. Thoroughbreds they were. He wished he had a sister exactly like Marion Dawson. The men took a later afternoon train back to town, separating at the station.
"So long, Bobby," said Dawson. "Thanks much for coming along. See you soon. Glad the stuff's going better for you. You've certainly given me a shot in the arm."
"It's been good for both of us," said Bobby. That night he carried out a decision he had resolved upon the day before. Randolph had seemed able to get all the information he wanted from a certain important page of the Galilean report on the one man who apparently knew the principles imperative to an expanded personality. Bobby considered himself entirely capable of pursuing such research as Randolph had made. He had never owned a copy of the Bible. Yesterday he had bought a Testament. The salesman had laid out quite an assortment. Bobby had chosen a copy that looked more like an ordinary secular book than the black ones with limp leather covers. His choice was based upon his expectation of treating it as he would any other book. He leafed in it, back and forth, for a long time before he came upon the particular thesis which the sculptor had considered important to a man's quest of dynamic personality. He read it with as much intensity of concentration as he might have studied the map of a strange country through which he expected to travel. There was a certain quaintness of phrase that intrigued him and commanded his interest. On and on he read, far into the night without weariness. The little book amazed him. When and if he had thought about it at all, he had considered the ancient document a jumble of soporific platitudes floating about in a solution of Jewish superstitions, and accepted by simple-minded people as a general cure-all for their petty anxieties and a numbing narcotic to dull their sense of wanting what they couldn't have. It was rapidly becoming apparent to him that here was one of the most fascinatingly interesting things he had ever read. Not only was it free of the dullness he had ascribed to it, it kept hinting of secrets. Secrets of a tremendous energy to be tapped by any man with sense enough to accept the fact of it, as he would any other scientific hypothesis, and accord it the same dignity, the same practical tests he might pursue in a chemical or physical laboratory. It was astounding to feel that he had in his hand the actual textbook of a science relating to the expansion and development of the human personality. How queer the people seemed bent upon setting it to music and drawing long faces while they piously intoned it. How ridiculous, and how unfortunate. This wasn't the libretto for a grand opera or epic stuff to meter into maudlin little hymns. This was a profound scientific thesis.
The very act of chanting it would be proof you didn't know what it was about. One of Merrick's most important discoveries that night was the fact that, unlike the usual scientific dissertation, which would be accessible only to the trained mind, there was enough of simple counsel in the book to be of high advantage to the least sophisticated. It was not a treatise intended for highbrows, but it was plain to see that the potential constituency of the book was sharply classified into groups. With the utmost candor, the Galilean had postulated 3 types of general capacity related to one another as 5-2-1. He had been entirely frank about saying to his intimates, in an intensive seminar session, that there were certain mysteries he could and would confide to them, which he had no intention of discussing before the general public, for the reason that the majority of people would be unable to understand. He noted, also with keen interest, the numerous occasions when the Galilean, having performed a service for someone, would ask him as a special favor not to tell anybody about it.
Practicing his own theories, all right.
It was clear from the record that men became interested in this strange, uncanny power by various processes of introduction to it. One man would see the remarkable power and beauty of it in the hands of another, and would resolve to have it for himself if it cost him the last dime. The matter was stated pictorially in a fable concerning a man who saw a pearl in another man's hand and sold everything he had to buy it. It was further stated that occasionally a man came upon this almost incredible thing by sheer accident. There was a story of a traveler who, while taking a shortcut across a field, stumbled upon a treasure chest. The book did not say what was in the chest. It just reported that the traveler gave up his journey, went home, converted everything he had into funds, came back, and bought that field. But nothing struck Bobby more forcibly than the constantly reiterated advice to approach life audaciously. Anything a man really wanted he could have if he hammered long enough at the doors behind which it was guarded. If he didn't get it, it was because he hadn't wanted it badly enough. No matter how patiently futile it was to continue battering the door, any man who wanted anything earnestly enough could open any kind of door.
Gotta have bloody knuckles, reflected Bobby, before you can say you tried it and it didn't work.
The fable accompanying this proposition told of a poor widow, with no influence at all, who wanted justice from a rich man. The judge was an utter rascal. The woman had no attorney, no friends, and no case. But she kept coming until she wore the judge out. He found himself entering more and more confidently into the mood of the man who had proposed these principles of what he had called a more abundant life, particularly struck by the poise and audacity. At length he closed the book and his eyes. He was not conscious of formulating a definite request. Had anybody told him he was praying, he would have been greatly surprised. He was endeavoring to construct a mental image of the kind of man who might be likely to have proposed such a philosophy. The thing that happened to him came quite without further invitation than that. As he attempted to analyze it later, the sensation he experienced, the most vivid and vital experience he had ever had, was as if a pair of great double doors, somewhere at that far end of a dark corridor in his mind, in his heart, in his soul, somewhere inside of him, had quietly parted, shedding a soft, shimmering radiance upon the roof, walls, and pavement of the long hall. The walls were covered with maps, charts, diagrams, weapons, and glittering instruments, and apparatus in glass cases. It was only a fleeting glimpse. The doors parted but a very little way. They quickly closed, and left the corridor so dark he could no longer tell where it was. Rousing, bewilderedly, he became conscious of a curious sense of exultation. Had he been asleep? He did not think so. He rose and walked unsteadily about the room, trying to recover as much as possible of his momentary illusion. Doors. Light behind doors. Light shining through.
I wonder if the corridor was always there waiting my discovery. Perhaps I could do something to open those doors wider. I must. Well, one thing is sure. I've seen it. It's there. It's real. Maybe I'll never get very far with it, but it can be done. Randolph wasn't as crazy as I thought. Next morning, as he was starting to the dean's office to arrange for his summer course in the face of old Nicholas's urgent request that he knock off until September and return to Windermere, he received a note from Nancy Ashford.
Perhaps you've read it in the papers, but I'll make sure, for I know you will be interested. Friday night, Joyce Hudson and Tom Masterson slipped over to Toledo and were married. Mrs. Hudson expects to sail on Saturday the 10th for Europe. She just called up to inform me of her plans. Leviathan. I thought you'd want to know.
At intervals, all day, he debated the advisability of sending flowers to the ship and decided against it. She would probably consider it an impertinence. No, he had irretrievably cut himself off. All that he had left now was his mounting interest in his work, into which he plunged with renewed enthusiasm.